A man stands alone on a mountaintop, his back turned to us forever. The painting hangs in Hamburg's Kunsthalle, catalogue number HK55161, measuring precisely 94.8 by 74.8 centimeters. Conservation records from the museum's 1998 technical examination revealed that beneath the visible surface, infrared reflectography detected multiple revisions to the figure's posture and the placement of rocks. The work has never left German territory since its creation around 1818. This is not fiction. This is what this painting still reveals. Here is what makes this image more than a pretty landscape. It captures the exact moment when romantic painting stopped being about what we see and became about what we cannot know. The figure shows us nothing of his face, his thoughts, his identity. He offers only his back, his silence, and the overwhelming question of whether standing above the fog means triumph or isolation. Museums have displayed this canvas for 2 centuries, and still, no curator can definitively say whether the man has conquered the mountain or been swallowed by it. The paradox lives in the paint itself. If you are listening to this between 10 at night and 3 in the morning, you are in good company. There is something about late hours that makes us want to stand where that figure stands, looking out at something vast and unknowable. I would love to hear what you see in the fog when you close your eyes. Leave a comment about your own moment on a mountain, real or imagined. And if these night walks through paintings bring you the kind of calm that makes sleep possible, consider subscribing. We will keep wandering together. Let us step closer now, into the cold. You are standing in front of the canvas in a dimly lit gallery. It is late. The museum is nearly empty. The painting is smaller than you expected, less than a meter tall, but it holds the wall with quiet force. You can see the texture of the linen weave beneath translucent glazes of Prussian blue and burnt umber. There is a faint smell of old varnish and conservation-grade linseed oil from a recent cleaning. The figure in the painting wears a dark green coat, and his hair is touched by wind you cannot feel. Around him, peaks of rock emerge from a white sea like islands. The light is neither dawn nor dusk. It simply is. You look closer at his right hand, the one resting on the walking stick, and you notice something strange. According to Dr. Helmut Boesch-Suppan's 1973 catalogue, Raisonné, of Friedrich's work, that hand was repainted at least once. The artist could not decide how tightly the man should grip the earth. In the spring of 1818, the city of Dresden hummed with a particular kind of intellectual restlessness. The Congress of Vienna had redrawn Europe 3 years earlier, and the German states remained a patchwork of kingdoms and principalities unified only by language and longing. Artists gathered in studios and coffee houses to debate what it meant to paint in the aftermath of Napoleon, in the shadow of new borders and old grief. Caspar David Friedrich, 44 years old, worked quietly in a modest apartment on An der Elbe Street, number 26, overlooking the river. He had been a member of the Dresden Academy since 1816, but he kept his distance from the institution's neoclassical orthodoxy. His students described him as reserved, even severe, though letters to his brother Christian reveal a man capable of dry humor and deep melancholy. The art market in Dresden at this time operated on a peculiar economy. Patrons wanted 2 things: grand historical narratives in the manner of Jacques-Louis David, or intimate Dutch-style genre scenes. Landscape painting occupied an uncertain middle ground, acceptable as background, but rarely commissioned as a subject unto itself. Friedrich had been struggling financially. His account books, preserved at the Kupferstichkabinett Dresden, show irregular income, small sales to private collectors, occasional teaching fees. He painted slowly, sometimes spending months on a single canvas, applying thin layers of oil with sable brushes, waiting for each glaze to dry completely before adding the next. This was not the method of a man trying to eat. It was the method of a man trying to see. In the months before he began Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, Friedrich had been walking. The landscape surrounding Dresden offered dramatic sandstone formations, particularly in the region known as Saxon Switzerland. Parish records and travel documents indicate that Friedrich made several excursions into these mountains between 1816 and 1818, often alone, sketching quickly in graphite and sepia wash. Dr. Werner Busch, in his 1997 study, Caspar David Friedrich, Life and Work, argues that Friedrich used these sketches not as studies for specific locations, but as raw material for composite landscapes, assembled in the studio to create an ideal rather than an actual place. The rocks in Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog belong to no single mountain. They are memory made visible. Friedrich worked without assistance. His studio was a solitary place. Contemporary accounts describe bare walls, a single easel, jars of pigments arranged by color temperature, and stacks of sketchbooks bound in marbled paper. He ground his own colors when he could afford to, mixing them with cold-pressed linseed oil and a small amount of Strasbourg turpentine. Analysis of the painting's ground layer, conducted during the 1998 conservation study, revealed a warm grey preparation applied over the linen, a mixture of lead white, bone black, and yellow ochre. This underpinning gives the entire composition a subtle glow, as if light were emerging from beneath the surface rather than falling upon it. The figure in the painting has been the subject of endless speculation. Some art historians, including Joseph Leo Kerner in his 1990 book Caspar David Friedrich and the Subject of Landscape, suggest it might be a self-portrait, though no documentary. Evidence supports this. Others point to Friedrich's friendship with the poet and forester Friedrich Gotthard von Gersdorff, who died in 1828 and who reportedly accompanied Friedrich on mountain walks. A third theory, advanced by the Hamburger Kunsthalle's own curatorial notes, proposes that the figure is not meant to be anyone at all, but rather a stand-in for the viewer, a surrogate self placed within the frame to guide our looking. The man's clothing supports this reading. His coat is well made but not aristocratic. His walking stick is functional, not decorative. He could be a scholar, a merchant, a minor official. He could be anyone with enough time and health to climb a mountain. Here is what Friedrich wrote in a letter to his friend Carl Gustav Carus in April of 1818, now archived at the Sächsische Landesbibliothek. The painter should not merely paint what he sees before him, but also what he sees within him. If he sees nothing within, he should stop painting what is before him. This was not metaphor. Friedrich believed that landscape painting had a spiritual function, that mountains and fog and twilight could express truths about human existence that no history painting could touch. But this belief came at a cost. Galleries wanted narratives. They wanted heroes and myths. Friedrich gave them silence and fog. The painting was not widely discussed when it was first completed. No major exhibition catalogue from 1818 or 1819 lists it. There is no record of a commission. no documented sale in the immediate years following its creation. It remained in Friedrich's possession, hanging in his studio, where visitors would have seen it alongside other works. The earliest known public mention appears in an 1823 letter from the painter Johann Christian Dahl, Friedrich's friend and eventual housemate, in which Dahl refers to the man on the rocks looking down at clouds. By then, Friedrich had painted dozens of other landscapes, each one a variation on the same question. What does it mean to stand in nature and feel both elevated and annihilated? Fast forward to the 1840s. Friedrich is dead. He died in Dresden in 1840, having spent his final years in declining health and obscurity. His obituaries were brief. The art world had moved on to other concerns, to the early stirrings of realism, to Courbet and Millet, painting peasants in fields. Romantic landscape painting seemed suddenly old-fashioned, indulgent, out of step with the industrial age. Friedrich's paintings were dispersed, sold off by his widow Caroline to pay debts. Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog entered the collection of a Berlin art dealer named Moritz Brandt, according to provenance research published by the Kunsthalle in their 2006 exhibition catalogue. From there, it changed hands twice more before being acquired by the Hamburg merchant and collector, consul Heinrich Wilhelm Camper in the 1870s. Think about what those decades meant for the painting. It hung in private homes, seen by few. Gathered dust. The varnish darkened and yellowed, as all varnish does, obscuring Friedrich's careful modulation of tone. When art historians of the late 19th century began to reassess Romanticism, they focused on Friedrich's contemporaries, Turner in England, Delacroix in France. Friedrich remained a footnote, a regional curiosity. It was not until the early 20th century, particularly after the 1906 Berlin exhibition, A Century of German Art, that critics began to recognize what Friedrich had been doing. They saw that his paintings were not sentimental escapism, but philosophical inquiry rendered in pigment and light. Now, here is where it gets more complex. The painting's rediscovery coincided with the rise of German nationalism in the early 1900s. Suddenly, Friedrich's lonely figures and northern landscapes were drafted into a narrative about Germanic soul and Teutonic mysticism. This was not what Friedrich intended. His letters and diaries, meticulously catalogued by scholar Sigrid Hinz in her 1974 edition Caspar David Friedrich in Briefen und Bekenntnissen, show a man interested in universal human experiences, in solitude and mortality, not in ethnic identity. But the painting could not control how it was used. By the 1930s, the Nazis had adopted Friedrich's imagery for propaganda purposes, reproducing Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog on posters and in textbooks as an emblem of Aryan superiority and connection to the land. The painting became a weapon it never asked to be. During World War II, the Kunsthalle was bombed. The museum's storage vaults held as many works as possible, but the building itself sustained significant damage in the Allied bombing raids of July 1943. Conservation records indicate that Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog survived unscathed, having been moved to a secure location outside Hamburg earlier in the war. Other Friedrich paintings were not so fortunate. Several were destroyed entirely. In the chaos of 1945, as Germany collapsed and was divided, the Kunsthalle worked to reassemble its collection. The painting returned to Hamburg in 1946, but it returned to a different world. The fog the wanderers stood above now felt less like nature and more like history itself. vast and impenetrable. Post-war art historians faced a challenge. How do you reclaim a painting that fascism had claimed? Dr. Werner Hoffmann, director of the Kunsthalle from 1969 to 1990, wrote extensively about this problem in his 1989 essay, Caspar David Friedrich, Reclaiming the Romantic, published in the journal Art Bulletin. Hoffmann argued that the painting's power lay precisely in its refusal to offer answers, in the figure's turned back that prevents easy identification, in the fog that obscures rather than reveals. The painting, he suggested, was fundamentally anti-authoritarian because it acknowledged limits to human vision and understanding. To see the wanderer as a conqueror was to misunderstand everything Friedrich had painted. In 1974, the Kunsthalle undertook a major restoration of the painting. Conservator Hans Joachim Thiel led the effort, documenting each step in reports now held in the museum's archive. The process took 11 months. First, the darkened varnish had to be removed, a delicate operation involving cotton swabs dipped in a carefully calibrated mixture of acetone and xylene, applied millimeter by millimeter to avoid disturbing the original paint. As the old varnish lifted, colors emerged that no one alive had seen. The green of the coat brighter than expected, the blue of distant peaks almost luminous, the fog itself not uniformly white, but shaded with pale yellows and greys. Thiel discovered small losses in the paint layer, particularly along the edges, where the canvas had been slightly compressed by its frame. These were filled with conservation-grade gesso and retouched using reversible pigments that could be removed if future conservators found better methods. X-radiography performed during the restoration revealed something surprising. Beneath the final composition lay traces of an earlier version. Friedrich had originally painted the figure's head turned slightly to the left, as if the wanderer were about to glance back at the viewer. At some point, he had overpainted this, turning the head forward again, denying us even that small connection. According to Thiel's notes, this change was likely made within weeks of the first attempt, while the paint was still relatively fresh. Friedrich had decided that the painting required complete separation, that the wanderer must remain forever in his world while we remain in ours, the fog between us absolute. Let us get specific about the ground layer. Friedrich used a double ground, a technique he employed in most of his mature works. The first layer, applied directly to the sized linen, was a warm grey mixture of lead white, bone black, and raw umber. Over this, he applied a thinner second layer, slightly cooler in tone, with more white and a touch of ultramarine blue. This double ground created a neutral middle value that allowed him to work both toward light and toward shadow with maximum efficiency. He could apply thin darks over it for the rocks and mountains, and thin lights for the fog, and the ground would hold both, providing a luminous foundation that unified the entire image. The pigment analysis from the 1998 study identified his palettes precisely: Prussian blue for distant mountains, burnt umber and raw sienna for rocks, lead white with Naples yellow and ultramarine for fog. Friedrich used almost no impasto. The paint surface is smooth, nearly enameled, brushstrokes invisible unless you stand inches from the canvas. There is no evidence of the hand that made it, only the vision it records. By this point, you might be wondering about the figure's identity. Let me tell you what we know and what we do not. In 1820, 2 years after the painting was likely completed, Friedrich's closest friend, the Edom painter Georg Friedrich Kersting, executed a small portrait of Friedrich in his studio. That portrait, now in the Alte National Gallery in Berlin, shows Friedrich from the back, standing at his easel, dressed in a coat remarkably similar to the one worn by the wanderer. The coincidence is striking, but it proves nothing. Friedrich often dressed his figures in his own clothing, simply because those were the garments he had available to study. Attempts to match the wanderer's build or posture to Friedrich's known physical appearance have been inconclusive. The painting is not large enough and the figure not detailed enough to allow forensic comparison. What we do know is that Friedrich thought deeply about the relationship between viewer and viewed. In an undated fragment from his notebooks, published in the 1974 Hints edition, he wrote, "Close your bodily eye, so that you may see your picture first with the spiritual eye." The painting asks us to imagine what the wanderer sees, to supply from our own darkness what the canvas withholds. It is a machine for generating interior vision. Within a season of the painting's creation, Friedrich's personal life changed dramatically. In January 1818, just months before or after he completed Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, depending on which dating is correct, he married Caroline Bommer, a woman 19 years his junior. They would have 3 children. Letters from Caroline, preserved at the Staatliche Kunstsammlungen Dresden, describe a household marked by quiet routine, by Friedrich's long silences and sudden enthusiasms, by his habit of walking alone before dawn. Marriage did not diminish his interest in solitude. If anything, it sharpened it. To have companionship and still feel alone, to stand beside someone and still face the fog by yourself, this is a very human contradiction. Perhaps the painting is about that too. Meanwhile, the art market was shifting. By the 1820s, lithography had made reproductions cheap and widely available. Paintings that had once circulated only among elite collectors could now reach middle-class buyers in the form of prints. Friedrich himself authorized several lithographs of his works, though there is no record of Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog being reproduced during his lifetime. The painting remained comparatively obscure, known to a small circle of admirers, but absent from the broader cultural conversation. It was not yet an icon. It was simply one painting among many, hanging wherever its owner chose to hang it, accumulating the quiet patina of time. To understand this fully, we need to look at the business of art in early 19th century Dresden. Friedrich purchased supplies from Johann Gottfried Pülz's shop on Schlossgasse, according to account books examined by Dr. Christina Grumt. Every color choice carried financial weight. Ultramarine, derived from ground lapis lazuli, cost more per ounce than gold. Friedrich used it sparingly for distant mountains where its intense blue would suggest infinite space. A painter's palette was a record of compromise between vision and economics. Zoom out for a moment. By the 1850s, landscape painting had become commercially viable. The Barbizon School in France, the Hudson River School in America. These movements validated what Friedrich had been doing in isolation. But he died believing his work had failed, that the fog had swallowed his career. Just 2 years after his death, his widow Caroline wrote to collector Carl Gustav Karus, offering paintings at reduced prices. The letters are heartbreaking in their practicality. She lists dimensions, subjects, asking prices. She does not mention beauty. She is a widow trying to survive. That is only part of the story. The other part is what happened to the paintings themselves as they scattered across Europe. Wanderer above the Sea of Fog travelled from Dresden to Berlin to Hamburg over the course of 50 years, each change of ownership erasing a little more of its original context. By the time Heinrich Wilhelm Camper acquired it in the 1870s, the painting had become separated from everything that once surrounded it. Friedrich's other works, his studio, his letters, his intentions. It existed now as a pure object, beautiful and mute, waiting to be rediscovered. The 20th century turned Friedrich into a different kind of artist. Expressionists admired his emotional intensity. Surrealists appreciated his dreamlike compositions. Existentialists saw modern alienation in his lonely figures. In 1970, art historian Robert Rosenblum published Modern Painting and the Northern Romantic Tradition, Friedrich to Rothko, positioning Friedrich as a proto-modernist who had anticipated abstract expressionism. Can you picture standing where the wanderer stands, your back to everyone who will ever look at you? Think about the hand that painted this, the 44-year-old man in a cold studio in Dresden, alone with his vision and his doubts. He has climbed mountains. He has lost friends and family. He has seen Napoleon's armies cross Germany twice, occupation and liberation both, and he has survived into a peace that feels more like exhaustion than triumph. He paints what he cannot say. The fog is not metaphor. The fog is where language ends and seeing begins. In recent decades, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog has become one of the most reproduced images in Western art. It appears on posters, album covers, advertisements. A Google image search returns millions of results. According to a 2015 Kunsthalle visitor survey, most people seeing it in person report surprise at its intimate scale. They expected something monumental. They expected certainty and found questions. The museum itself has changed its approach to displaying the work. In the 1950s, it hung in a large gallery, surrounded by other romantic landscapes, part of a chronological survey of 19th century German art. By the 1990s, it had been given its own wall in a smaller, more focused room, presented as a masterpiece that required contemplation rather than contextualization. Current museum didactics, updated in 2020, emphasize the painting's ambiguity, its resistance to single interpretations, its invitation to personal reflection. Visitors are encouraged to spend time with it, to let it work on them, rather than to extract information from it quickly and move on. What had been a regional painting by an obscure artist has become a global symbol of something we still cannot quite name. Loneliness, aspiration, the sublime, all of these and none. The painting's power lies in its refusal to choose. The wanderer stands there still, silent, looking out at fog that has not lifted in 200 years. We stand behind him, looking at his back, and in that gap between his vision and ours, something profound happens. We become aware of ourselves as viewers, as people who stand outside the painting, wanting to be inside it, who long to see what he sees, but must accept that we never will. From crisis to lasting influence. Friedrich died believing he had failed, but his failure became the foundation for everything that followed. Without Friedrich, there is no symbolism, no surrealism, no abstraction as we know it. He taught painters that landscape could be interior, that mountains could be states of mind, that fog could be a subject as legitimate as any saint or king. The patterns that Friedrich established, the lone figure, the vast space, the turned back, the withheld answer, these patterns repeated across art history, in Munch's lonely walkers, in Hopper's isolated observers, in Richter's blurred landscapes. Each generation rediscovered that it is possible to paint what we cannot see, to make visible the invisible, to stand on a mountain and understand that the view means nothing and everything. What we learned from Friedrich is that painting does not have to explain. It can simply point, can say, "Look here, this is what it feels like to be human and small and uncertain, beneath a sky that goes on forever." What we still have not learned is how to live with that knowledge, how to stand in the fog without demanding that it clear, without insisting that mountains reveal their summits and distances announce their measurements. The painting asks us to accept not knowing, to find peace in ambiguity, to see beauty in the blur. There is a present-day parallel worth considering. We live now in an age of constant visibility, of cameras and screens and surveillance, where privacy is quaint and obscurity is failure. Everyone must be seen, must be known, must turn their face forward and declare their identity. And yet, here in Hamburg's Kunsthalle, a man painted 200 years ago still stands with his back to us, still refuses to be known, still looks out at something we cannot see. He stands as a reminder that hiddenness is not weakness, that mystery is not something to be solved but something to be respected, that some truths reveal themselves only when we stop demanding revelation. The painting is quiet in the way late night is quiet, in the way thinking is quiet when it goes deep enough. It does not shout, it does not argue, it simply stands there, year after year, waiting for people like you, listening to this in the dark hours, trying to make sense of days that blur together like fog. Maybe the wanderer is not looking at anything at all. Maybe he is just standing there, breathing, being alive for another moment on a planet that does not care whether we understand it or not. Maybe that is enough. Maybe the fog is not hiding something beautiful. Maybe the fog is the beautiful thing. If you ever find yourself in Hamburg, go see it. Stand in front of it for longer than feels comfortable. Let the other visitors pass. Wait until you are alone with it, or as alone as a public gallery allows. Notice how the paint sits on the canvas, how thin it is, how carefully applied. Notice the small cracks in the varnish, the record of 2 centuries of temperature changes and light exposure. Notice your own breathing. And then, if you can, notice the exact moment when you stop looking at a painting and start looking through it, when the wanderer's silence becomes your silence, when his fog becomes yours, when standing there in the museum becomes standing there on the mountain, and you realize that the painting was never about him at all. It was always about you, about all of us, about the moment when we stand at the edge of what we know and stare into what we do not, and find that the not knowing is exactly where we need to be.